Hi, thank you for tuning into my talk today, which is on Doris Lessing's life writing. And I've been watching with great interest the other talks in this online series, and it's just fantastic to be able to contribute in my own small way today. And I'm thinking that last month, May 2020 in particular, I listened to a fantastic talk about the pleasures and difficulties of writing the biographies of exiles. And it made me think about biographical subjects who, because they move across borders or because they're forced to move through conflict or forced displacement, they don't leave behind much of an archive. And that made me reflect on my own interest in life writing and in particular Doris Lessing's life writing, which has really formed an integral part of my PhD thesis. This is partly because the archive surrounding Lessing's life and work is, to put it mildly, intimidatingly large. Lessing was, as many of you will know, a prolific writer. She published 26 novels, dozens of short story collections, an opera libretto with Philip Glass, and no less than 6 memoirs and autobiographies across her long life. In addition to the published material, there's a huge number of archival unpublished papers held both at the Harry Ransom Centre at the University of Austin in Texas, and here in Britain in the the British Archive for Contemporary Writing at the University of East Anglia, and there's a collection of Lessing's letters at the University of Sussex. So this enormous paper trail suggests to us that there's many stories of Lessing's life to tell. But the bare bones of her life are this: that Doris Lessing was born in 1919 in Kermanshah, which is modern-day Iran. Her parents had met just a few years before during the First World War, in which Alfred Taylor, Doris Lessing's father, had met Emily McVeigh, Doris Lessing's mother, just after he lost a leg before the Battle of Passchendaele. So Alfred, who's very badly wounded in hospital, is then nursed by Emily, who's a nurse during the First World War. Shortly after meeting, the couple decided to move to Kermanshah to try and build new lives for themselves, where Lessing was born and where her younger brother Harry was also born and raised. But then in 1924, the family decide that they're going to make a trip home to England and they'll bring the children with them. And during this holiday at home, they all attend the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, still in 1924. And there, Lessing's parents have a fateful encounter with an advertisement. And the advertisement says, "Get rich quick on maize in Southern Rhodesia." So, Alfred and Emily Taylor decide not to return to Persia, to their old lives, but instead to move to the British colony of Southern Rhodesia, which is modern-day Zimbabwe. And they go with their 2 small children. Lessing would later say, quote, "This encounter at the Empire exhibition changed my parents' lives and set the course of mine and my brothers." The family were to begin new lives farming on a rural outpost of the British Empire. And although Alfred and Emily had planned to stay in Southern Rhodesia for just 5 years, they actually never made enough money to come home to England. So the result is that they end up sort of stranded, marooned in Southern Rhodesia, unable to make enough money to sell the farm and come home. And there's evidence that they were hoping for some sort of social mobility by a successful venture in the colonies, but that's not how it works out. The result of this is that Doris Lessing was raised in a racially segregated white settler culture until she was 30 years old. And then in 1949, she makes her escape to London. When she made this important journey, Lessing, who's 30, was accompanied only by her 3rd child, Peter, who was very small at the time. And in the single suitcase she was carrying, she had a manuscript of her first novel, The Grass is Singing, which would be published a year later in London. And from this point on, perhaps the story is a little bit more familiar to all of us. After establishing herself in London in the 1950s, Lessing pursues a remarkable career as one of the 20th century's most important and unconventional writers. So even now, after 5 years of reading and rereading Lessing's work, I'm continually amazed by her provocative and her restless attempts to place herself outside of social, political and literary establishments. For example, in the 1980s, after enjoying several decades of literary success in Britain, Lessing sends a manuscript to her regular publishers, but not under her name. She submits it under the pseudonym Jane Somers, and her publishers then rejected it, and the official reader's report said this novel is too depressing to publish. So Lessing, still posing as Jane Somers, publishes the two novels elsewhere. Susan Watkins, who's a Lessing expert based at the University of Leeds Beckett, notes that there's an integral relationship between, on the one hand, the Somers hoax, and on the other hand, the subject matter of the two novels that Lessing published under this pseudonym, because these two novels deal with and they question the expectations for female writers who were entering middle age. For other examples of how Lessing playfully rejects or places herself outside of literary establishments, perhaps I'll refer to the title of my talk, Where is this British Empire? Because in 1992, John Major, then British Prime Minister, offered Lessing a damehood, bearing in mind this would have made Lessing a dame of the British Empire. And she replied to John Major's secretary with a letter that's now in the University of East Anglia's archive and has been published in full elsewhere. And she says in her reply, quote, "Where is this British Empire anyway? Surely there isn't one." And she then goes on in the letter to say that she regrets being unable to accept John Major's kind offer. But she says, quote, "As a young woman, I did my best to undo that bit of the British Empire I found myself in, old Southern Rhodesia. And surely there's something unlikable about a person when old, accepting honours from an institution she attacked when young." As we might glean from this comment, Lessing was throughout her life a committed anti-imperialist. So which route through Lessing's life might we want to pursue? There are so many possibilities. We could think about her brief membership of and her later fraught relationship with the Communist Party. Or we could discuss Lessing's remarkable legacy as a free woman. She's the author, after all, of the groundbreaking feminist novel The Golden Notebook. But simultaneously, the publication of The Golden Notebook also ensured Lessing's antagonistic relationship with feminist thought and feminist activists. After she published the novel and became a feminist icon, Lessing immediately rebuffed the advances of the feminist movement. Or we could consider Lessing's significant career as a writer of science fiction. My own interest in Lessing's life writing, by which I mean, in the confines of this talk, Lessing's autobiographical and experimental non-fiction. So my interest in Lessing's life writing doesn't really narrow these possibilities down any further. Lessing is the author of multiple memoirs, multiple autobiographies, several documentary accounts, and even a counterfactual memoir of her own life. The record of Lessing's life is complex, sometimes it's even contradictory, and reading these texts side by side does not necessarily produce a stable or even truthful account of Lessing's life. But what I want to suggest here today is that there is a thread of continuity that goes across the wide body of Lessing's life writing, and that's the overarching interest in Lessing's colonial settler childhood, the aftermath of empire, and the legacies of imperialism. Lessing's upbringing as a farmer's daughter, living on a rural frontier of empire, exercised a powerful influence upon her long writing career. And when I think about Lessing's life in its entirety, and it is a long life, I sort of think about it as on a series of historical hinges, a series of crucial moments in the 20th century. In 1919, she's born in the ruinous aftermath of the First World War. Then she's raised in the 1930s during the final decades of the British Empire, and then she emerges as a published writer immediately after the Second World War. So it's therefore not really surprising to me that the significant body of Lessing's life writing both depicts her memories of a white settler childhood and always remains in pursuit of the colonial past. So basically what I'm saying is that I'm reading Lessing's life writing from her first memoir, Going Home, to her final published memoir, Alfred and Emily, 1957-2008. So over half a century between these two text publications. I'm reading the entirety of Lessing's life writing as fundamentally shaped by and concerned with the legacies of British colonialism. And I'd even go so far as to suggest, as I do at some length in my thesis, that Lessing's restless experiments with different forms of autobiographical self-representation, so her experiments with different literary forms within her life writing, reflect her lifelong interrogation of empire and its aftermath. So throughout this talk, I'm going to discuss Lessing's memoirs and autobiographies and her travel narratives, in which Lessing's life is the sole or partial focus of the text. There are several travel memoirs which are about, not so much about Lessing's life, and certainly not about her time in Southern Rhodesia. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to discuss these. So the texts that I am going to make some brief reference to include Going Home, published in 1957, Lessing's first account of returning to Southern Rhodesia, and In Pursuit of the English, a documentary about her first year in London, and the 2 volumes of her autobiography, Under My Skin and Walking in the Shade, her second African travel memoir, African Laughter, which is about 4 trips she made to Zimbabwe during the 1980s, and then finally the fascinating Alfred and Emily, which is part memoir, part imaginative account of what would have happened to Lessing's parents if they'd never married. That's published in 2008. So we're talking about a span of texts that go right across half a century. Again, in the interests of drawing the line, I don't tend to discuss Lessing's autobiographical novels as her life writing, but it is important to note that especially the Children of Violence series and their remarkable protagonist, Martha Quest, certainly narrate scenes from Lessing's life in Southern Rhodesia, and indeed Martha is almost certainly an autobiographical version of Lessing herself. And the Children of Violence novels have been discussed by some critics as a form of life writing. So why don't we turn now to Southern Rhodesia, and as a little bit of context, Dane Kennedy, who's a historian of settler history, tells us that for families like Doris Lessing's, who moved to Southern Rhodesia in the 1920s and 30s, they would have arrived to a country that was rigidly stratified along racial, ethnic and cultural lines. Racial segregation preserved the use of public facilities for the exclusive use of Europeans. And settler culture was, according to Kennedy, I'm going to quote him now, preeminently the expression of the white community's tenuously held position of predominance in the colonial order. But despite their positions amongst a white ruling minority in Southern Rhodesia, Lessing's family's lives in the British colony were neither luxurious nor easy. It's important to bear in mind that they were not wealthy people, and in many ways Lessing's childhood was not a privileged one, despite the obvious privilege of her whiteness. On the one hand, Lessing undoubtedly despised settler culture. She always described settler culture as similar to a mass disease. She saw it as infectious, and she also thought of herself as being compromised should she have been forced to stay in Southern Rhodesia. So there's no doubt that she wanted to both get out of Southern Rhodesia and that she rejected the white supremacy on which it was based. But on the other hand, in interviews, Lessing would always state that everything that had made her a writer happened to her in Southern Rhodesia. So there's this real sense that although she's incredibly critical of white settler society, the landscape of Lessing's childhood is the point to which all of her life writing must perpetually return. In her first memoir, Going Home, in what I find to be both a revealing and quite a moving passage in some ways, Lessing's reflecting on her life in Britain, and she says, "In the past few years, I've lived in over 60 different houses, flats, and rented rooms. But the fact is, I don't live anywhere. I never have since I left that first house on the Kopje." Kopje being a small hill. And the house she's talking about is the mud and wooden pole farmhouse built by her parents, which perched on a hill overlooking the bush. And here in Going Home, Lessing is already highlighting for us how the farmhouse is her ground zero. And she would repeatedly revisit this originary site throughout her life writing. So it's not surprising at all when the farmhouse shows up again 50 years later in Alfred and Emily. She talks about the hill on which the house was built that gave me views for miles. As a Communist Party member in the 50s, and as an outspoken critic of white rule, Lessing was exiled by the white Southern Rhodesian government in 1956. and she was actually only able to return to the country after it had become Zimbabwe in 1982. So for Lessing, the fact of her exile, created by these long decades in which she couldn't return to her former homeland, would always, as she put it, quote, exclude me from my own best self. And in African Laughter, her second travel memoir, she describes this leaking lake, an inexhaustible well of tears which she held inside herself during those 3 years of exile. But for Lessing, the act of return, both practically and ideologically, is fraught with difficulty, because to go back to the landscape of her childhood is also to return to the colonial past, which, as we remember, is a colonial past of which Lessing is completely critical. And this difficult relationship with her former homeland wasn't resolved through the country's process of formal decolonisation. For those of you who aren't familiar with this history, after a bloody 7-year war, Zimbabwe finally achieved independence in 1980. Lessing herself is then invited to return in 1982. Lessing's relationship with Robert Mugabe and his regime changed dramatically over time in the latter part of the 20th century. She's initially very optimistic, and she publishes numerous articles and mentions in her books that she thinks Zimbabwe is going to be a success. But later, especially after the turn of the new millennium, she has a series of outraged denouncements of Mugabe's, as she calls it, reign of terror. This is particularly after Robert Mugabe is revealed to have committed atrocities against his own citizens. What I'm trying to highlight here, by returning to Lessing's relationship with first Southern Rhodesia and later Zimbabwe, is that her response to her former homeland wasn't static. She remained highly alert and responsive to the country's dramatic changes. She was always keen to find out what was happening on the ground. So her assertions, if we think back to that quote from Going Home, that the farmhouse is her only true home, that she's never lived anywhere in London, she's always thinking back to the house on the Kopje. This suggestion sort of jostles uneasily alongside her understanding that to return to the site would to become complicit in what she says is the, quote, paranoia, the adolescent sentimentality, the neuroses of white settlers. Perhaps in short, to summarise again, what I'm saying is that if Southern Rhodesia is the point to which Lessing's life writing must always return, the journey homewards is bound to be a complicated passage. I think that Lessing's life-writing project is processual. Her memoirs and autobiographies reject, by my reading, a teleological view of selfhood, in which Lessing's life might write beyond or somehow move past the influence of empire. Lessing's not writing herself out of her entanglements with Southern Rhodesia. On the contrary, she's returning to them, probing them, looking at them from different angles. Writing both before and after Zimbabwean independence, Lessing is determined to trace the ongoing legacies of colonialism within her own life. And by reading across all these different texts, I'm suggesting that Lessing's life writing compromises a fixed or final view of the self. She never brings her memories of settler life to a definitive conclusion. So, in the little time that I have left for this talk, I'd really like to do a sort of cross-textual discussion of Lessing's life writing. And I'm hoping, I would prefer to do this without slides, so you'll have to bear with me, but I'll read out all the quotes I'm going to discuss. I'd really like to show, just very briefly, how certain memories and scenes are reiterated across different texts by Lessing. And as I've already sort of suggested, if I try to visualise the relationship between these texts, I think of them as like a constellation of books that are connected by multiple threads. So with that in mind, I want to just hone in on a very particular, distinctive feature of Lessing's family home on the Kopje, a feature of this farmhouse that was so important to her that she always maintained it was her true sort of emotional home. And I want to talk about a tree, a particular tree that's known as the Malanga Tree. And I'm going to think a little bit about the tree's roots and its trunks and its branches. And this is partly because the Malanga Tree marked the edge of Lessing's childhood home. The farmhouse and the surrounding farm that Lessing's parents built and then rather unsuccessfully tried to farm was called Kermanshaw Farm. So even the name of the farm itself is revealing to us how their former lives in Persia, which were considerably more privileged, are sort of perhaps a more typically colonial lifestyle of swimming pool parties and afternoon tea. That life in Persia continued to haunt their later lives in Southern Rhodesia. Every farm they had afterwards was called Kermanshaw Farm. And it sort of reveals their frustrated dreams, I think, of imperial progress. Because remember, they're never able to get off the farm. They're never able to make enough money from the land. So I digress. But Lessing's many processual returns to the farmhouse converge at the site of the Malanga Tree. Sometimes it's incorrectly spelt Mawanga, so like with an M-A. And the tree lay at the outer boundary of the cleared bush surrounding her family's farm. And although the tree is, to me, curiously absent from Lessing's first memoir, Going Home, it's described in some detail in her second memoir, African Laughter. And it's also there in the first volume of her autobiography, and there's a significant passage on it in Alfred and Emily. Otherwise known as Paracopsis angolensis, the Malanga is a species indigenous to Zimbabwe. It's perhaps best known for reaching considerable heights. The tree often grows to 20 metres tall, and indeed Lessing remembered this particular Malanga tree as the tallest landmark in the area. When Lessing first returned to the independent Zimbabwe in 1982, she immediately travelled to a reunion meeting with her brother Harry. The two siblings haven't seen each other for several decades by this point. And upon meeting Harry, she says, quote, "What happened to the old Malanga tree?" And then later in the text, in African Laughter, when Lessing actually gets to visit the site of the farm for herself, one of the first things she notices is, quote, "Gone was the big Malanga tree that once dominated the landscape, full of honey that we cropped once a year." The erstwhile tree appears again in Under My Skin. This time it's a vital coordinate of Lessing's childhood. In front of my parents' house was a big Malanga tree, its pale trunk scarred with lightning, an old tree full of bees and honey. In Alfred and Emily again, Lessing recalls the tree as, quote, "always being full of birds, sporting a conspicuous broken branch, which had buckled beneath the weight of a locust swarm." So if we take a moment to read and reflect across these descriptions, the Malanga tree is a borderline which distinguishes the family from the uncultivated bush beyond their farmhouse. It's also a symbol of home, a home that the family share with bees and birds. And it's also symbolic of the passing of time because it's home to the different seasons of migratory birds who would roost in its branches. Lessing also remembers the distinctive black lightning scar which marked the trunk of the tree, and this scar should remind us that the climate that Lessing and her parents lived in was particularly challenging as settlers, and they had to contend with this climate throughout their 2 decades on the farm itself. The Malanga occupies a key symbolic function in Lessing's multiple returns to the natal site of her childhood. It's a local landmark for sure, it's the tallest tree for several miles around, but it also promises something more. It promises Lessing's family a legacy once they're gone. According to African Laughter, Lessing's parents would repeatedly declare, quote, "You can bury us under the old Malanga tree," meaning it was certainly not as good as an elm or an ash or an oak, but it was the next best thing. This imagined burial under the old tree would, they imagined, anchor Lessing's family to their new homeland. In a practical way, the tree is imagined as giving them a burial right in southern Africa. It's a gravestone right in that description. Moreover, we should be attentive to the fact that the Malanga was prized by Lessing's parents precisely because it was not an ash or an elm or an oak, all of which are associated with the English countryside. The Malanga is an indigenous southern African plant. It belongs more to the bush than it does to the farm, and it becomes, for the Taylors, Lessing's maiden name, of course, an approximation of indigeneity. And when I say approximation, I also mean appropriation. The Malanga is a symbol of their supposed right to the southern African soil, both in life as farmers and in death when it functions as their gravesite. Across all of these memories, we might understand that the tree reflects a deeply held desire to be at home on the farm. As her parents anchor themselves to this local landmark, imagining that the steadfast Malanga tree will outlast them, the Malanga also promises them a particular genealogical certainty. It's a family tree. It's going to connect the lives of numerous generations of the Taylors. As with the concentric lines that mark the inside of a tree's trunk, there's also the implicit suggestion that the Malanga can be the record of their life in Rhodesia, or I should say lives. According to this reading, Lessing and her brother would become the inheritors of the Malanga. Lessing and her brother would become the natural heirs to the homestead. The tree not only commemorates her parents' lives, but suggests the futurity of their descendants, who they hope, being Lessing and her brother, they hope their children will continue to inhabit the land after their death. Lessing also had her own personal form of communion with this particular tree. Seeking sanctuary from her mother, Lessing and her mother had quite a fractious relationship that's returned to many times in Lessing's writing and especially in her life writing. So when she was trying to get away from her mother as a teenager, seeking some sort of sanctuary, Lessing would, quote, sink in the shade of the tree not 100 yards from the house. And after she'd found some comfort in this spot, she would read books and daydream about adult freedom. For Lessing, in a lot of her descriptions of trying to get off the farm or resting against the tree or going just beyond the boundaries of the farm, there's a real erotic charge to these encounters, the sense of escaping her parents' expectations and values. The Malanga makes some really interesting appearances in Lara Feigel's recent memoir, Free Woman, which is about Feigel's reading of and relationship with Doris Lessing's writing. And towards the end of the memoir, really interestingly for me, Feigl makes a sort of journey, maybe even a pilgrimage, to the site of Kermanshaw Farm in Zimbabwe. She actually spends the night there. And in the process of writing this trip, Feigl emphasises how the Malanga tree connected Lessing to the farm and to the space that she Lessing would always refer to as her myth country. So Feigl tells us, she, Lessing, read sprawled under the Malanga tree at the bottom of the hill, the ridges of her spine tessellating with the roots protruding from underneath her. So this is a scene which reiterates numerous sections from Under My Skin, and by rewriting it, Feigl depicts the tree as an extension of Lessing's developing teenage body, and its roots, as we'll notice in this scene, anchor her to the southern African soil. But I have just one more sort of twist and one more contention in this talk, because I want to suggest that to read the Malanga tree as an anchor or a tomb or a cliched living representation of Lessing's family tree, one which allows her family to be at home in Southern Rhodesia, all of these readings fundamentally misread the vexed forms of homecoming staged across Lessing's life writing. Because rather than grounding Lessing permanently within the Zimbabwean landscape, in actuality, the Malanga tree reveals her unstable, her tenuous position within the country. It does not offer longevity, and it does not secure Lessing permanently to the land. It has a dual, unstable meaning across Lessing's life writing. For evidence of this, we need only examine the final retelling of her return to the farm in Alfred and Emily, where Lessing once again recalls what she's now calling the Malanga tree. Once again, she tells us about her parents' wish to be buried beneath it, and adds, they used to exclaim, well, that old tree will still be here when we're gone. Once again, the imagining of the Malanga tree aims to ensure the futurity of her parents' afterlives on the farm. But Lessing, in this reiteration, dryly adds, quote, the tree lasted not much longer than they did. She then goes on to tell us that the tree was felled by lightning shortly after her father's deteriorating health drove the family permanently from the bush and back into the suburbs of the local town. This is a really sad moment in the family's history. Lessing's father, who's a diabetic, is no longer able to be on the farm, and he dies several years later, quite unhappily, in Salisbury, which is now known as Harare. Here, the literal meaning of the tree in Alfred and Emily as grounding or rooting the family to the soil is misleading. In actuality, it provides neither a permanent monument nor a record of their existence on the farm. Because it's destroyed several years after they leave, the Mawanga's shifting, developing meaning for me, highlights the joys and the possibilities of reading across Lessing's numerous life narratives, because each of these texts alone doesn't give us a complete image of the Malanga, and every time we read from a different perspective, our understanding of it becomes slightly more complicated. For me, this tree is a deliberately dismantled monument to Lessing's settler childhood, and she has to question and undermine its central importance within her autobiographical writings. Because, to use Benedict Anderson's words when he's thinking about cenotaphs and tombs of unknown soldiers, Lessing's Malanga Tree is saturated with ghostly national imaginings. It's really important that the Malanga Tree is not permitted to become a tomb for Lessing's parents or a figurative set of roots for Lessing herself, because to do so would mean that she's kind of shoring up, securing or preserving in some way Southern Rhodesia. And we should remember that to preserve this white settler colony is an act to which Lessing was resolutely and ideologically opposed. This is the same anti-imperialist who asks, where is this British Empire when threatened with a Damehood? So the tree is a nexus for exploring Lessing's conflicted sense of belonging to her former homeland. But if she returns over and over to the farm and to the tree, it's always to uproot its symbolic functions. Like the farmhouse itself, which crumbled back into the bush less than a year after her parents left, Lessing won't permit this monument to her childhood to remain standing. In each rendition of the Mawanga's collapse, Lessing emphasises how, like the house on the kopje, the Malanga became indiscernible from the surrounding bush, so it's neither a local nor a personal landmark. And just some sort of thoughts as a summary. I'm suggesting by reading across Lessing's life writing here that the Malanga is a sort of ironic symbol of permanence. And it's also a vital touchstone for exposing the contradictory forces that compel Lessing to always be going home or attempting to go home. Despite the tree's central position within her life writing project, it doesn't root Lessing to Southern Africa, nor does it deliver on its genealogical promise, and neither is it the permanent monument or tomb to her parents' lives on the farm. Writing in Under My Skin, in a quotation that's really underpinned all of my readings of Lessing's life writing, Lessing explains that the central problem for the autobiographer is, quote, that of shifting perspectives, for you see your life differently at different stages, like climbing a mountain while the landscape changes with every turn in the path. Her description of an ascent through shifting terrain is indicative for me of Lessing's processual life-writing project, one that's always in motion. Her memoirs and autobiographies don't fix the facts of her life, but they return patiently and sometimes obsessively to particular memories, particular experiences. In Alfred Nemely, the last book to be published within her lifetime, Lessing declared she was, quote, still trying to get free from the traumatic 20th century histories of empire and of conflict, and all of her life narratives are suggestive of unfinished business. Just as a one final concluding sentence, I'm suggesting that all of Lessing's life writing reveals a series of entanglements with Britain's colonial past that will not or cannot be undone. Thank you so much for listening, and especially listening all the way to the end. I would love to read any of your comments online, or to hear any of your thoughts or any of your own readings of Lessing's life writing, or life writing in general. So please do get in touch. Let me know what you think, and I'll look forward to being in contact with you soon. Thanks.